So we've looked at the game of the video game that I'm talking about. Now let's dissect the video of said game. It's probably hypocritical of me to even say I hate video games that try to be cinematic or anything more than I pulled the man's head off, but at least to me, I feel video games offer something that a movie or TV show just kinda can't pull off. Like a man's head. And that's context and drive. It's not often that a game can straddle that fine line anymore, especially in this day and age of ultra overproduced walking simulators and ultra overproduced walking simulators with automatic weaponry. It's maybe a product of my upbringing, having been born in 1994, that to me, cinematics in games were special. I grew up with the Sega Genesis and games like Flashback, Sonic 2, and PGA European Tour that were essentially some of the only games I own that told most of their story through non-verbal gestures and small bits of text. No, seriously, PET is the tight canon, trust me. As I got older and got a hold of the PS1 as my first real, you're a man now, shape your destiny console, I about shit myself when the game was cinematic. It was mainly a treat that a game entertained you with the same style of cinematography as a big screen movie, or used the same lingo and jargon you heard your friends say on the playground. It wasn't too uncommon for game cutscenes to be mainly at the start of a level or a world, and then at the end, usually to tie up a plot point or give some sort of context. Rarely was a game I played what I call cinematic. I think the first game I ever played that actually could come close to this style of interacting with the story in game was probably Half-Life 2 when I first played it on the orange box on my 360. Something about that game struck me so hard, and it cemented to me how a game can integrate both gameplay and story, and in a way that feels organic, goal-oriented, and engaging. I think I maybe was 13 or 14 when I first played Half-Life 2, and ever since I was always disappointed in games that tried to take their stories seriously or in a way that made the story more important than the actual game sections. I mean, the whole point to me that made Half-Life 2's story so interesting was the fact that the characters felt, well, human. The cast wasn't a bunch of super soldiers who could shrug off wounds. No, Gordon was a dude in a hazmat suit that fried his brain with morphine at every step. Eli was a guy with a troubled and complicated past, having accidentally been part of Earth's downfall. Barney was an average Joe who liked to chill at a bar. Alex is to me and many others the best written and handled female character in a video game, because of her warmth and emotions that carry her throughout the series. She gets hurt, she kicks ass, she gets annoyed at Mossman for her secretive and suspect nature.
Of any research effort going
Enough of your bullshit!
To me as a writer and analyst, I look for stories that really flesh out the fact that characters could be real people. It's why I fucking hate superhero movies and loathe them so much, because yeah, cool, your parents may have been killed and you were an orphan, but Batman is still just some dude who punches people in a gimp outfit. You can't change that. You can't convince me to take something like Sonic seriously when he was born to be an advertisement for Sega products and his fans are middle-aged man-children who jerk it to characters designed for small children. You just can't change that. There's a line where believability is more important to me than something like broad mass appeal. It's why I say something like Skyrim is a fun game, but the story is absolutely summarized as baddragon.com versus shouting LARPer, and I just can't take it seriously when the whole story is so shallow and full of holes. What makes Silent Hill 2's story so interesting is that it isn't even, well, accessible. It's a deep, touchy, and uncomfortable story that not many people have to hopefully ever experience in some areas. I mean, what's easier to recommend to someone? A game about blowing a hole into a spider demon's brain with a laser gun? Or a game about a man shoving his hand into a toilet? Well, I'd be more interested in the toilet thing, that sounds like something right up my alley, but I'm sure that the more lighthearted and fun story is much more appealing. It's especially funny to me as well that in this day and age of supposed awareness and advocacy for mental health and self-discovery, society still sees the mentally ill as ill. There's this uncomfortable and hesitant vibe to want to distance ourselves from those things that make us uneasy or topics that are heavy. It's why I feel it's actually bad to censor words like rape or suicide, because all it shows is a want for the bad stuff to not be real, or code it in something softer. It gives power to the already powerful topics and makes it seem taboo or disgusting that we live in a world where physical and mental atrocities are committed. There's a real sense of progression that's running through current history, don't get me wrong, and just because I'm mentally ill myself, it doesn't mean I want everyone to know the searing agony of an existential collapse. I just wish that people would be more educated into the world of mental health and less disgusted by it, because, you know, the sad reality is, you could be just like me, and all it could take is a car crash, a hostile work experience, or debt to turn your life into a spiraling hellscape of static and uncertainty. Speaking of uncertainty, Our game starts off in a very uncertain way. We meet our protagonist, James Sunderland. From outside sources, James was allegedly a store clerk, but like I said, I'm trying to avoid future or external content other than what the game shows us. Besides, it really doesn't matter what his profession, middle name, or favorite cocktail is. James is in a roadside bathroom, contemplating to his reflection about how his deceased wife Mary could possibly be in the town of Silent Hill. He points out a very good reason, dead people don't write letters, but he decides to look for Mary regardless by trying to decipher where the special place was that was mentioned in the letter he received. Without much prodding, James descends down the foggy path that leads to a cemetery right before the main path into Silent Hill, where he startles a young woman who warns him to stay away from the town because something isn't quite right about it. James proceeds to point out that he doesn't really care and he's going to enter anyways. This might be a good time to bring up the voice acting of SH2. Some people claim the voice acting is awkward and stilted and that it could have been better, but, I really think that the awkward and somewhat eerie delivery is actually perfect. I personally have a weird and almost synthetic approach to my speech from years of trauma, isolation, and depression. The closest way I can approximate why I sound the way I do at times is because of a want to sound like I still have normal emotions, and to pick and choose the right thing to say, to convey that I'm not totally empty, and that my brain isn't a mess of about 300 different things at once. It's hard to adequately explain it, but I mean, if you get it, you get it, and that's the only way I can put it. James pushes on into the town where he finds that the streets are actually empty, save for a big pile of gore, and a figure in the fog which he decides to follow, which just screams good idea if you ask me. Eventually, James stumbles into a construction area where he gets distracted by a radio and introduced to the first monster of the game. Without hesitation, he bashes the thing into the ground, takes the radio, and decides to push on down the streets, which are now populated by more monsters. This is about the time where if I was in this circumstance, I'd go, yeah, this is cool and all, but I think I'll go back to the car, drink a bottle of whiskey, and convince myself this was a fever dream. But no, James keeps going, where he eventually makes his way to the Woodside Apartments. In here, James finds more monsters, a light, and a toy. Jokes aside, James also finds another human being in the apartments, a kid who steps on his hand and gets him into a real huff. Eventually, through some more prodding, James discovers someone else in the apartments too, but we'll talk about him later, don't worry. After a brain-busting puzzle that a millennial or zoomer just couldn't possibly grasp, James pushes deeper into the apartment complex and comes across the figure he saw earlier, violating some of the monsters he ran into so far. If you want my deeper analysis on the monsters, don't worry, I'll go over each one and what they mean, but as a separate video. After unloading enough bullets to make a classic Resident Evil player cry, the figure wanders off, and James reluctantly pushes on. After a few pool parties and juice bars, James comes across another human being in the town. Eddie, who would make a great advocate for the slogan "Crack Kills" if this game came out in the 80s. Eddie doesn't seem to be, doing so hot, so James leaves him to his business, says goodbye, and keeps on trucking on through toilets and trouble until he comes across the woman he met in the cemetery earlier, who now reveals herself to be named Angela. Also, just like the monsters, don't worry, I'll do a deep dive on the main cast as well after this video, so if you feel I'm rushing through this, remember this is just the story segment to give context to my later analysis. With Mr. Cuddy in hand and coin in pocket, James works his way closer and closer to the end of the apartment complex, where he has a wonderful run-in with the figure he's dubbed the Red Pyramid Thing, that fans of the series affectionately call Pyramid Head. The fight is tense on a first run if you don't know what you're doing, but Pyramid Head leaves after a while, and once again, James decides to follow where the creature went. James ends up back onto the cold and foggy streets of Silent Hill, where he runs into the munchkin that stepped on his hand earlier. Despite the whole hand hate, the kid also seems to know who Mary was, which leads James to change his tune from annoyance to curiosity, as so far this is the only person who he's came across that might even have had some sort of information about the whole situation. Regardless of losing the kid, James treks towards Rosewater Park, where he meets another person who looks and sounds almost exactly like his wife, except her name is Maria, her own original character Do Not Steal. At first, James doesn't seem to show a lot of interest in Maria, even with all her gaslight gatekeep girl-bossing, and he reluctantly lets her follow him to the next location he thinks his wife might be. A hotel the two stayed at years ago, and supposedly Maria knows the way there. After some mileage, the two stop at a bowling alley where James goes in alone because Maria hates bowling for some reason. I don't know, maybe she's afraid someone will drink her milkshake. Inside the bowling alley, James walks in on Eddie engaging in a little in-out with a pizza, and learns from Eddie that the kid is named Laura. When asked to help, Eddie would rather chow down on that greasy goodness. I mean, I don't blame him, look at that thing. James goes back outside and gets Maria to help him try and track down Laura, where she leads him to a nightclub. Sadly, James can't grind on that pole until his ass hits the floor, but the two catch Laura entering into the next area of the game, Brookhaven Hospital. In the hospital, James shoots skanky cosplayers for a while and eventually comes to a room where Maria needs to lie down, apparently from a hangover because, you know, hangovers just sort of happen. James wanders to the roof of the hospital where Pyramid Head gives him the old 1-2 and into an area that houses a key he needs to progress. Using his mad RuneScape fishing skills, James 99s his way to eventually find Laura. Laura, being the ever so helpful sort, traps James in a room where he faces a foot fetish nightmare come to life, and when the fight is over, James finds himself in what's commonly called the otherworld of Silent Hill. I'll also be covering the town and some backstory later on during the monster section of the video series, so don't worry, I'll give my thoughts on this all later. In this decayed and twisted version of the hospital, James eventually comes across Maria again, who isn't saying grats on James's 99 fishing accomplishment from earlier on. After a hug and some lunch, the couple come across a hallway where Pyramid Head decides to rear his ugly head and impales Maria. James completely breaks down defeated and miserably continues on through the town, this time in a totally dark, more hostile setting, guided only by a mysterious note that eventually leads him into the Silent Hill Historical Society, which loves to show off its clan memorabilia. In this building, James descends into the guts of the town further and further and further until he eventually ends up in the Ring, and then into Toluca Lake Prison, where he runs into the totally stable genius Eddie. In the prison, James comes across the ghost of the Executioner's Chariot from Dark Souls 2 and a scientist from Half-Life, but ultimately finds his way into even more holes that lead further down, but unlike the cool novel, James doesn't find some sploosh, he finds an elevator, which leads him to the subterranean labyrinth of the town. Once in the labyrinth, James discovers that Maria is somehow alive again, but in some sort of prison cell where she drops my favorite line in the entire game.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
She also seems to know more and more about Mary at this point, pointing out a videotape that was left behind in the hotel when James and Mary visited last time. At this point, James agrees to find a way to get to Maria. No, totally, that's all he wants to do, and makes his way through the other half of the labyrinth. At one point in his spelunking, James comes across Angela again, this time with her being confronted by a monster. I have a lot to say on this scene later on, so I'll discuss it in a later video as well. Angela beats on the corpse of the creature and starts to doubt and mistrust James, as opposed to her mainly skeptical and uneasy nature from their earlier encounters. As if this wasn't a blow to James's already virtually non-existent ego, he eventually makes it back to the cell that Maria was in, but rather than being very much alive, she's very much dead. Again. James leaves Maria and hopelessly trudges on, this time into a cemetery, to once again plunge deeper into what looks like a cold and disused freezer. Eddie is down here, but he's worsened, now revealing to James that he, much like Angela, is turned against him, and decides to use Southern justice to solve his problems. After a bit of a firefight, Eddie scampers off into a meat locker and sadistically points out from somewhere in the room how he killed a dog and shot its owner in the knee, showing a much more clear reason as to why he was drawn to hide in Silent Hill from the authorities. Eventually, he starts to rip into James, saying how the two are alike and that the town called both of them for whatever reason. But James isn't in the mood for a TED Talk and kills Eddie, ending in a grief-filled moment after the fight. James emerges somewhere near the lake of the town and rows over to the hotel where he and Mary stayed, where he runs into Laura again. After some prodding, she reveals the letter she was using as a way to trap James earlier, and she also mentions how she and Mary were actually friends at the hospital she stayed in, even sharing the same nurse named Rachel, the hidden 17th Colossus. While reading the letter, James questions how old Laura is, noting that the letter mentions her 8th birthday. The answer is a resounding last week, shocking James as he thought Mary died 3 years ago. Before long, Laura runs off again to find a letter she dropped, also from Mary, leaving James to look around for a way to get to the room that he and Mary stayed in. After some fat shaming from an elevator and a trip to the world's coziest bar, James manages to not only find the tape that Maria pointed out that he forgot, but he also clears a path to the room he stayed in. To his surprise, James doesn't find Mary in the room, but puts the tape into an ancient and primordial device known as a VCR. The tape at first reveals some old home video that James took of the trip to Silent Hill years ago, but then shifts into a morbid reality. James suffocated Mary at some point in time during her illness, and the gravity of what James had done shatters him to the point of total numbness. Laura finds him slumped in the chair in front of the TV and tries to snap him to attention. Rather than keep the guilt inside him any longer, James reveals to Lara that he murdered Mary, which sends Lara into a fit of rage, causing her to strike and berate him until she gives up on him and leaves, once again. In this version of the hotel, James can find a tape of one of the conversations he had with Mary's primary care physician, which also reveals that Mary didn't die 3 years ago, and that the 3 years James keeps repeating was rooted from this argument. If we couple this with the fact that Lara mentions her birthday was a week ago, this means Mary has been dead for less than a week at least, and this entire time, James has suppressed the memory of the murder as a form of coping with the trauma. This isn't as far-fetched as you think, as yeah, there's huge gaps in my memory from traumatic events. I can't even remember what being 22 to 24 was like, because most of my life was a mess, and anything from 8 to 13 is just a fuzzy blur of memories that I can occasionally recall bits and pieces of. As James continues on in the warping and ruined hotel, he eventually runs into Angela sadly for the last time. Angela seems totally deluded, and at first confuses James for her mother, which she eventually reels from. She reveals that her mother also pointed out that she deserved the physical and sexual abuse her father inflicted on her, and begins to regress, eventually belittling James and pointing out a very sad reality. He can't help her. After a moment of silence, she even asks James for the knife back, but he refuses, causing her to turn her back to him and ascend up the staircase she's been standing on this whole time. Trying to be the greatest at conversation, James points out that the room is hot, to which Angela says it's always like this for her, and without another word or gesture, she leaves, never to be seen again, leaving James alone and the fire to grow. After a while, James continues through the hotel, eventually leading him to yet another round of emotional bukkake. Maria is trapped by 2 pyramid heads and impaled, yet again, causing James to at first collapse and admit he needed the 2 to help punish him and come to grips with what he'd done to his wife. In a final show of defiance against the town, and even his own subconscious, James fights back and Pyramid Head commits suicide, to never ever make another appearance in a Silent Hill product again. After this, James walks down a hallway, reliving a memory of Mary berating him for trying to be helpful, giving us an insight of the unintentional emotional trauma that his wife caused him as a result of her own hesitations and fears. This scene always stuck with me the older I got because, well, I've been on both ends of the spectrum. The voice work here is spot on, and it's why I always say a game doesn't need remastering, because the rawness and intensity is just...
James! Wait! Please don't go! Stay with me! Don't leave me alone! I didn't mean what I said! Please, James! Tell me I'll be okay! Tell me I'm not going to die! Help me!
Now this is where things are going to deviate in terms of dialogue based on what actions the player's taken throughout the game, but the scene plays out the same. James comes across Maria or Mary, who transforms into Fleshlips 2.0 and attacks with Mothra beams. It's a very underwhelming fight, but symbolically it's impressive, and I'll talk about it later. After enough lead lollipops, the monster goes down and James ends the nightmare. So, what was it all about? The general consensus is that Silent Hill 2 is about overcoming and accepting guilt. I've seen a few people say it's about mainly just sexual frustration, which is kinda narrow, but I can see where they're coming from. To me, those 2 above topics are true, but I think to me it's a story about the inevitable loss of a loved one and what that can do to a person's psyche. It's a story about a man who has nothing left to live for after destroying the one thing he did live for. It's a story about the persistence of a soul that's trying to find either purpose or pain. It's a very human story, and to me, when you take out all the complicated symbolism and metaphors, it's something we can all relate to. Even if you don't want to believe me, consider the sad reality of life. It ends. When you're with someone you love day in and day out, watching them fade prematurely and knowing you'll outlive them but you won't forget them, that's real, man. Even if that's not the case, you can apply a friendship in place of an intimate relationship and it's equally as devastating. A family member, a pet, anything. And it's a primal, deep existential dread that we can't even describe in words, but we know the gut-wrenching and mind-spinning pain of. And it'll drive you to your limits. But, wait a minute. How does the game end? I've been debating on how to go about this, but I really don't want to spoil the endings. Not because I'm lazy, trust me, because, well, Silent Hill 2 is special to me, and I think the way you end it is unique to how you play the game, which is how it was actually designed. Besides, I also am of the philosophy that you should still actually play the game and experience it for yourself. A Let's Play, this video series, or a wiki, or another less cooler and less sweary video than mine can't really capture the experience of the game. You've also probably noticed by now that I've intentionally summarized the story in a broad way and skipped out on things like puzzles and room designs. It's the same philosophy as the endings to me. You can sit there and absorb all of what I just said and regurgitate it, having learned nothing about the source material in the process, and that's exactly what I don't want you to do. I may sound callous, but yeah, I strongly suggest just playing the game and experiencing the story yourself. I hate when people use things like top 10 videos or random lore videos just to fit in some sort of I know what it is quota, and then those same people spit out stupid statements like, yeah, when the horse dies in Shadow of the Colossus, it was pretty sad. There's no way I can convey certain things from this game to you anyways, like how the dog ending is objectively the best ending, or how I personally feel when I hear Mary's cry for James to stay with her during the hallway memory. Some things are just, they're meant for you to experience, not to be told. It's like how Noah Gervais points out that you can see the Grand Canyon in a million photos, but not really understand the sheer primal instincts that occur when you see it in person. There's just something about the story of Silent Hill, too, that despite my cynicism, my dark humor, and my repressed nature, it's one of the few things I've ever played that's made me cry because of the emotions it can elicit, the sheer power of the vocal performances, and the genuine realness of the characters and what they've been through. I said in my Let's Play of Silent Hill 2 how the story of the game was done respectfully and maturely, and it came out at the right time from the right people. In this day and age, something like this game's story could happen, yeah. I hate that loaded statement of, it could never be done today, because that's bullshit. Anyone can make anything they want, it's how they make it, and why, that makes something impactful or meaningful. What I meant by the right people at the right time is the fact the game came out in 2001 from Japan and not America. I'm not some sort of weeb, I don't know hardly a damn thing about Japanese culture, except what I've known from weebs. What I do know is American culture and American social politics. In 2023, the time of writing this analysis, America is, well, it's a fucking mess, let's be real here. You have insane right-wing lunatics that scream about shit like climate change being a myth and that God elects the President of the United States. You have insane left-wing lunatics that will gladly tell you you've been living your life wrong the entire time and you should hate yourself for having the audacity of being born white and being straight like it's some sort of genetic curse. The huge problem, and it's gonna sound like such a millennial thing to say, but yeah, it's just old out-of-touch boomers that cling on to power on both sides. The social climate in America as of writing this, yeah, it tends to be in favor of more left-leaning, but that also comes with its own detriments. Things like mental illness in mainstream media and social circles tend to be handled in the worst possible way by the worst possible people to appeal to the worst possible people. I can feel your rage, by the way, going as far as to have already typed up a response that's longer than this entire video series, but hear me out. Trust me, this is something everyone should learn how to do. I can't stand when adults use shit like children's entertainment, the most trite and bottom-of-the-barrel material, to try and generalize complex topics in the most safe and clean way possible. It makes my fucking skin crawl that people get their idea of mental health and how to treat it from shit like workplace seminars that are led by 60-plus-year-old people who only care about making a quota and trying to prove they're hip by saying, just take a day off, dust off the cobwebs, and drop your baggage. I fucking loathe things like the statement, adulting is hard. It pisses me off to no end when someone just says, go get a therapist, it'll solve all the issues. When the modern age's left treats mental illnesses like they're just some sort of quirk that makes you special, especially in regards to neural issues like autism, it just makes the people that legitimately have those issues more alienated and creates more stereotypes that will create more social tensions in the future. By proxy, the people that are on the right will tend to see things like DSBM music as glorifying suicide or that drawing something gory or weird is somehow going to make you a school shooter. There's still this divide of misunderstanding by both sides of what mental health actually is, and well, as someone who suffered from it consciously since the age of 8, it's something that our country currently can't seem to get, and I don't think it will for a long, long time. In my mind, Silent Hill 2's release date is also its biggest blessing. In 2001, mental health was kinda, well, it was backseated socially. I mean, yeah, I can freely say I prefer it that way. I don't know why in this day and age, everyone needs to know someone's political affiliation, sexual orientation, views of pro-life or pro-choice, gun control stance, their opinions on trans and gay individuals, their religious association, or possible mental afflictions, all before they have earned the right to stand near someone at the bus stop. I fully admit to people when I'm socially comfortable to do so, that I have things like OCPD, CPTSD, or MDD, but when it's appropriate. You know, there's a great deal of research you can look into as to why a thing called small talk exists in our social structures, and I wish more people understood that turning deep, complicated fields of study or philosophy into just trends or talking points, it's not only disturbing, it's just disingenuous at best and condescending at worst. Silent Hill 2's story is almost, well, I'd hesitate to say it's neutral in terms of its stance on mental health. On one hand, you have those that say James should be killed for murdering his wife and that he deserves to be punished eternally for his crime. On the other hand, you have people that will say he did the right thing and that his actions are a result of complicated and fragmented emotions and that his reconciliations with his past is more than enough to help him move forward and accept life from that point on. In 2023, there is no way in hell you could say on TV, a film, or a game that a man choking the life from his dying wife was a good thing. Like, seriously, think on that for a minute. This isn't just some sort of loaded question either, this is a fact. If someone said, I have no opinion in this day and age, there would be one side saying the person is obviously a liar, and another side saying the person is guilty by omission. In 2001, you could just say, well fuck man, it's just a video game, why the fuck should it matter? And you know what? I kinda miss that. I miss that time in history when you didn't have to know and absorb every facet of every single thing, and you could be indifferent or flat out uninterested and a mob of people didn't crucify you for saying modern Star Wars is token and hollow. Silent Hill 2 really is a gem, because the game doesn't have a clear defined agenda or motive. It just wants you to think. It wants you to dissect, and it wants you to come to your own conclusions. In this day and age, if something isn't immediately explained to someone, God help them, they might have to engage their critical thinking skills. I mean, fuck, I know, right? Yet socially, I feel that Silent Hill 2 is respectful. It's not overtly offensive, it's not trying to guilt you at every turn, and it's certainly aware that not everyone is going to like it. There's not a whole lot I want to change, really. I don't think that shit like James's day-to-day life is important to the story, and I'm glad it's not a focus. I don't think that we need to have someone go on a long, drawn-out explanation of the town's history the moment James walks into the town. I don't think that we need to know what's under Pyramid Head's helmet because it's not important to the story that's presented. There's a level of maturity to Silent Hill 2's story that I respect, and I wish that more writers, games, and films embraced, and it's summarized very well with a simple statement. Anyone could be like James, like Eddie, or Angela, because we're all human. There isn't a person alive that isn't compelled to do things out of anger, desperation, or what they think is the right thing to do. All of us, including you, have had thoughts like these characters had, and you can't even deny it. It scares the ever-loving hell out of us to think that each person we sit next to in traffic has the ability to just drive into us for no reason, or for a reason, and end our page in the book of life. It is absolutely mortifying to think that the girl that gives you your coffee in the morning might actually be planning to slit her dad's throat because he tells her she's not successful like her sister. There's no way a person can ever tell what someone's been through, or how that person handles their own mental baggage. Hell, for an example, I know that when someone says you should get a therapist, they don't have any ill will, but consider the implications that sentence can be translated to by someone like me. It could mean, you're a mess and I don't trust you. Or it could mean, you depress me, I can't handle or deal with you anymore. I have insurance from my job, yeah, but do you know how long a waiting list for a therapist can be? Do you know that not every therapist is helpful, and that someone as introspective as me finds a great deal of redundancy to repeating my thoughts and emotions to a person? And I'm fully aware that my issues are permanent. All from just one sentence that sounds fairly innocuous? That's all it takes for someone like me. And that's after years of therapy, medication, and healing. So you can imagine what it sounds like to me when someone tries to say, I don't trust Billy Willie because I saw an episode of Criminal Minds that said blurger blur. You think I'm being hypothetical, I bet, when I'm actually being serious. My mom and grandma used to honest-to-God label and diagnose people with disorders simply from watching CSI and Dr. Phil, and I know that there's a group of people just like them that do the exact same thing somewhere else in this world at all times. Media affects public perception whether or not you choose to engage with it. I've literally had someone assume I had autism 6 years ago because they said, and I quote, "Well, you're really smart and you don't lie." Yeah, that was this guy's entire basis of diagnosing me with a neural disorder that was predicated entirely on my intelligence and honesty. Where he got that idea from, I don't even want to know. But do you know how damaging that misconception was? It caused me to nearly quit my old job, and I had a total mental collapse because not only did he think I was autistic, but the entire district, my superiors, and some of the staff on board that day, well, they were all working under the assumption I was autistic. And I didn't know who started this rumor or how long it had been around, but I know one thing for sure, I was fucking livid. It still makes me annoyed, and it's been years since that even happened to me. I even still feel the need to always end that story by saying I'm not autistic, not because I doubt myself, but because the anger from that event and the mental devastation it caused me was so severe that it left me scarred and defensive forever. I am always now incredibly cautious of how I am around new people, and pick and choose my words and mannerisms very carefully to avoid the possibility of someone even trying to hazard that guess again. I'd also like to preface there's nothing wrong with being autistic, but the fact that people thought I was based on someone's perception from some outside influence or the other is why I loathe and despise the power of mainstream media. I mean, stupid people are influenced by stupid things, it's really that plain, unfortunately. Yet to me, Silent Hill 2's story doesn't need to be mainstream to be well understood, in my eyes, because much like the town itself, you actively seek it out, and in Filth, it will be found.